Good morning. Man, great to see everyone here this morning. As you guys can see, we're in the middle of a series entitled Words Matter, right? And what we're doing in this series is we are challenging ourselves to actually think before we speak, because our words matter that much. Now, if you're just coming in on this series, there's a few things that you need to know that we've already discussed. First of all, there is power in the words that we speak. The Bible talks about this in Proverbs chapter 18, verse 21. The tongue can bring what, church? Come on, church. What? The tongue can bring what? Death or life. Right? I mean, you guys understand that. You get that. Right? That our words have the power to give life, or our words have the power to take life. And some of you have experienced that firsthand, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. But something else we need to understand that's very vital is where our words come from, the source of our words. How many of you have ever said something and you thought to yourself, man, why did I just say that? Why did that just come out of my mouth? This is what Jesus says. He speaks into that. Matthew 12:34, you brood of vipers. How can you who are evil say anything good? For out of the overflow of the what, church? The heart, the mouth speaks. The good man brings good things out of the good stored up in him, and the evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in him. In other words, the tongue, our words, are tied to our heart. What comes out of here is a direct result of what's in here. Right? And so if we're not saying what we need to say, if we're not speaking how we need to speak in a Christ-like fashion, then maybe we need to do some heart examination. Okay, so what we're going to be doing now from here on, and for those of you who missed that first lesson, I want to encourage you to go back. You can watch it off of our new webpage, whcentral.church, or if you'd like a copy of that on CD, we will give that to you for free. We want to put that in your hands because we want to get this right. We want to get our mouths right. But what we're going to be doing over the next couple of weeks is we're going to be talking about some things that we definitely do not want coming out of our mouths. Okay? So to introduce our first lesson and really our first topic, I want to show you guys a picture. It's my family, and we're at Disney. This was nearly 5 years ago. Okay? We had just moved to Winter Haven, and we looked so happy, right? I mean, we've got the Disney shirts on, and man, the kids, they're all smiling. But let me tell you the truth about this picture, okay? The move from Alabama was very difficult for my children. And I really didn't realize how difficult it was going to be. But I mean, I'd been at Robertsdale for 14 years. That's all they knew was Alabama and those sets of friends. And they had, grown up homeschooling in the co-op there. And the church family, that's all they knew. And then we snatch them up and we bring them to Winter Haven, Florida. And we just thought that they would immediately adjust and everything would be great. And it wasn't. It was really, really difficult for them. And so Julie and I, we started thinking, okay, what can we do to kind of take their minds off of that? And we thought, oh man, we can get annual passes and we'll take them to Disney World. They love going to Disney World. And so we did everything we could, right? I mean, immediately, man, we started working on our driver's license to prove that we were Floridians, and that's a lot of work, let me tell you. And, we were going through that whole process so that we could get the Floridian discount passes, right? And you do save a lot of money. And so we ended up getting our driver's license, and then I ended up buying the tickets, and we started going to Disney. And this is one of the first pictures. And everything looks wonderful and great, but let me tell you what happened, okay? Let me tell you the truth. This picture doesn't really tell the truth, okay? We buy the tickets and we go in. And it's a Friday morning, it's my day off. And we go into their bedroom, we're like, guess what, kids? We're going to Disney. But again, they're really struggling now. You have to understand that. And the kids are like, Disney? We don't want to go to Disney. In fact, one of the kids are like, do we have to? Can we just stay home? And I just snap. I mean, I've been working on this, trying to get everything together, and I look at my kids and I'm like, are you kidding me? I'm like, do you realize how many children would love to be you? To just switch places for you just one day. It was one of those, don't you know how many children are starving in China? You know what I'm talking about? I mean, I was pouring it on. I've done all this for you. And they're like, we just really don't want to go. And they were complaining. And then Julie gets involved. And she's fired up. And she said, let me tell you something. You guys don't realize how much money we have spent on getting you guys to Disney. And she said, let me tell you something. We're going to go to Disney, and you're going to be happy about it. You're going to be happy in the happiest place on the planet. You understand me? And they're like, yes, ma'am. And so we go, and we're like, you better smile for the picture. You know what I'm saying? And so we look happy. But the kids are not real happy, and man, they whine and they complained about going to Disney. Now, my kids are not the first to do this, okay? This has been going on for a long, long time. I mean, you go all the way back to the very beginning, to the Garden of Eden, and basically you have God who comes to Adam and Eve, and they've sinned, remember, in the garden, and basically He says to them, what have you two done? And what does Adam do? Man, he starts to complain, right? Genesis chapter 3, verse 12. Well, the woman who you gave to be with me, he says, she gave me of the tree and I ate it. God, if you hadn't given me this woman, I mean, I would have never eaten of the tree, but you had the bright idea of bringing her into the world, you know, and so he's complaining about everything. And he wasn't the only one. You get into the book of Job, and Job is going through some difficult circumstances. And he says in chapter 10, verse 1, he says, I loathe my very life. And that word loathe means hate. He says, I hate my very life. How many of you have ever thought that? I hate my very life. Therefore, he says, I'm just going to give free rein to my complaint. In other words, I'm not happy with the way things are going, and so I'm just going to shout it out. I'm going to let everybody know about it. I'm just going to complain all I want about it. I'm just going to give free rein to my complaint. But probably the greatest illustration biblically of a group of people who complain would have to be the children of Israel, right? Now, if you don't know their story, it's absolutely crazy. I mean, these people, for hundreds of years, they complained to God about being in slavery. They cry out to God, right? Exodus 2, 23 through 25, the Israelites groaned. They complained in their slavery, and they cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. And God heard their groaning, their complaints, and He remembered His covenant with Abraham and with Isaac and Jacob. And so God looked on the Israelites with concern about them. And He wasn't just concerned for them. He actually got involved. He did something, right? He raised up a guy by the name of Moses. And he did these 10 amazing, miraculous plagues through Moses, even to the point to by the time the 10th plague was done, Pharaoh had had enough. And he says, okay, he says, take your people and go. You're no longer slaves. Just get out of here. I don't want to have anything else to do with you. And so Moses leads them out of Egypt. And once they get out of Egypt, Pharaoh starts to think about what he's done. This was my labor. And so he gets his army together and he says, hey, look, I want you to go and I want you to get these people back. We've got to have them. And so here's the Egyptian army, and they're pursuing the children of Israel. And it gets to the point to where now the Israelites are trapped. They've got a mountain on one side and they've got a sea on the other side, and now here comes the Egyptian army. And guess what God does? Another miracle, He divides the Red Sea and He allows the children of Israel to walk across on dry land. And once they get across safely, as the Egyptians began to pursue them, God closes up that sea and wipes out the entire Egyptian army. And if that wasn't enough, when the people of Israel get thirsty, God gives them water from a rock. When they get hungry, God sends them manna and quail from heaven. And their clothes, the Bible talks about how their clothes never wore out. How awesome would that be? And so God is just, He's blessing them over and over and over again. And what does the children of Israel do? Do they go, praise God? God, you're so awesome. God, you're so amazing. Thank you for all that you do. No, here's what the children of Israel do. Exodus chapter 16, 2 through 4. And you can just read the whole thing of Exodus, and man, it's this over and over and over again. It says, in the desert, the whole community, what, church? Grumbled against Moses and Aaron. And the Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. Here they had been complaining about being in slavery in Egypt. Now they're complaining about being out of Egyptian slavery. And they said, we sat around pots of meat. Look at the picture they paint of how good it was in Egypt. And ate all the food we wanted, but you've brought us out into this desert to starve us, this entire assembly, to death. And as you continue to read on, right, it talks about how they would say, why couldn't you have just killed us in Egypt? Why did you bring us all the way out here to die? And these people, the Canaanites, are going to steal our children, and they're going to take away our wives, and everything is going to be horrible. And it was just one complaint after another. And you say, well, Slate, I get it, but what's the big deal? Everybody complains every now and then. Why is this such a big deal? Let me share a few thoughts with you. Let me share some things about complaining, grumbling that is very dangerous. First of all, number one, it offends God. Say that with me this morning on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. It offends God. That's important. Our complaining, our grumbling makes God angry. In fact, Numbers chapter 11, verses 1 and 2 says, now the people, they complained. And it says, and when the Lord heard them, His anger was aroused. And then the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed the outskirts of the camp. Are you with me? God got so tired and so angry at their complaining that He actually shot fire down from heaven and He burned the outskirts of the town or the camp. And so if you come home one day and your yard is just burned up, I'm just saying it may be because you complain too much. No, I'm kidding. Why does God get so angry? Why did this frustrate God so much? For those of you who are parents, you'll understand this. How many of you as a parent have just blessed and blessed and blessed your children? You have just poured out blessings on them, even stuff that they didn't even realize you were doing for them, right? You continually bless them. And yet they start to complain. How did that make you feel as a parent? I'll tell you how it makes me feel. I'll just be honest with you. There are times when my kids are complaining, and with the love of Jesus, I just want to look at them and say, you are nothing but a bunch of spoiled brats. It absolutely makes me angry. It infuriates me, and I think about God, and I know that it has to make God angry to hear His children constantly complaining. But here's probably why it angers him the most, because He takes our complaints personally. Exodus chapter 16, verse 8 says this. You are not grumbling against us. This is Moses and Aaron speaking. You are not grumbling against us, but against who, church? But against the Lord. Imagine with me, if you will, that every time we complain, it's not about our circumstances. It's not about the weather. It's not about other people. But imagine if every time we complained about different things or about different people, God took that personally as if you were complaining about Him. What I want you to do right now is I want you to bring to mind what you complain about the most. Think about it just for a second. What do you complain about the most? I'll tell you, for me, and I know I complain about a lot of things, but one of the things I probably complain about the most is traffic. In fact, I'm to the point to where I get my wife to drive everywhere we go because it's so crowded, and there's always someone who's driving too slow, and they're always driving too slow in the left lane, and people are constantly pulling out and just, oh man, and it makes me so angry, and I complain, whine, poor pitiful me, right? What do you complain about? Same thing. Some of you may complain about not being married. Then you get married and you complain about your spouse, right? And being married. Then you start to have kids and you complain about the kids. Been there, done that. Just did it. Or you complain about the weather. Weather's so terrible in Florida, right? During the summer it's just too hot and humid. During the winter, even though we're not getting a lick of snow, we have those short little spells where it gets down to 40, 50 degrees where other people are in shorts and flip-flops, We're like, what is this? We're supposed to be living in Florida. It's supposed to be warm. And it rains too much, or it doesn't rain enough, or the Wi-Fi is just too slow. What do you complain about? Because admit it, we're all tempted to do it. And here's what I would say to all of us. The problem is not the weather. And the problem is not the traffic. And the problem's not the Wi-Fi. Here's the problem. We have taken our eyes off the goodness of God and we have placed our eyes dead center on ourselves. I want to read that again, but I'm not going to do it. I'm going to let you do that right now to yourself. And I want you to really let that sink in. And this leads to the curse of complaining. There's a really powerful verse in Philippians chapter 2. You can look there, verse 14. And to kind of set the context, Paul had one desire. He wanted to go to Rome. And he wanted to preach the good news about Jesus. Because Paul felt like, man, if I could take Rome, if I could take Jesus to the leaders in Rome, then I could make a difference in the world. Because Rome was a powerhouse at the time. And so that was his desire. I want to preach in Rome. But instead of preaching in Rome, Paul ends up becoming a prisoner in Rome. For 2 years, he sits behind a jail cell. Hard floor, bad food, chained to a different guard, 24/7. Now, I got to tell you, if it were me, if I were in place of Paul there, I would have been very tempted to complain. I mean, God, my heart, my desire was very pure. I wanted to preach in Rome, but instead of giving me what I wanted, you make me a prisoner, and all I've done is serve you. All I've ever done is been faithful to you. And God, don't you realize the impact that this would have had if you would have let me preach, if you would have let me share the gospel in Rome? That would have been me. But instead of complaining, instead of whining, instead of telling God why He got it all wrong, this is what Paul says to the church at Philippi. He says, do everything without grumbling or arguing. Another translation puts it like this: do everything without what, church? Without complaining. That's tough, isn't it? I mean, that puts the bar up here. I mean, whatever you do, wherever you go, Paul says, don't complain about it. Why? Because it offends God, but also there are some consequences that we need to talk about as well. And we're going to talk about the spiritual context of this, but in a very practical way. Someone once said, and I thought this was really good, complainers have spiritual bad breath. You ever been around someone who had really bad breath? I mean, that aroma just kind of hits you in the face and you're like, whoa, and you're like, talk to you later, it drives you away. Well, the same is true when you're around someone who complains about everything all the time. You drive people away. In fact, case in point, raise your hand if you love to be around complainers. Look around. And so in a very practical way, it will drive people away from you. No one will want to be around you. But also in a spiritual context, well, let's just notice what God says. Numbers 14:27, how long will this wicked community grumble against me? I have heard the complaints of these grumbling Israelites. So tell them, as surely as I live, declares the Lord, I will do to you the very thing I heard you say. In this wilderness, your bodies will fall. Every one of you 20 years old or more who was counted in the census and has grumbled against me, not one of you will enter the land I swore with uplifted hand to make your home. Notice God says, you have complained so much that the very thing that I want to bless you with, the very thing that you want the most, I am not going to give it to you. Now hear me out this morning. I can't prove that God still does this today. But I would say there's a good chance, because it's in His Word and because we can use His Word, God says, as an example, I would say there's a good chance, no, probably a great chance that God still does the same thing today. That there are things that God would love to bless us with, and there are things that we really want, that our heart desires, but because we whine and because we complain about so many things, God says, you know what? No. I'm just not giving that to you. That's what I do with my kids. Right? We'll get in the car and all my kids, for some reason, they all want the center seat. And only 3 can sit in the center. Somebody's got to go in the back. And I'm constantly telling them, look, somebody be mature enough to volunteer to sit in the back. They want to sit there and complain and whine and gripe about having to sit in the back. And I'll look at them and say, you know what, that's enough. You want to have company this weekend? No, you're not going to get that. I was going to treat you guys this weekend. Thought we'd go to Andy's and maybe, get some milkshakes, something like that. But you know what? We're just not going to do that. Because I've had enough. You're driving me crazy. And I'm sure we drive God crazy when we whine and complain, and He continues to just bless us so much. Anybody else in here blessed? There's something called confirmation bias, and I know some of you are scratching your head. This is a definition of it. If you're critical and want to find something wrong, this is what it means. You can very easily interpret new information in such a way to prove your preconceived bias. Okay? Now, in layman's term, this is what it means. Let's say that you invited someone to services here today. And before they came through the door, they had already decided, they had this preconceived bias, I am not going to like this church. And so when they walked through the door, immediately they began to find all kinds of things that they did not like. But let's say you were invited today and you had no preconceived bias. You had no negative thoughts. You walked through the door and immediately you notice how loving and how friendly and how kind everyone was. And immediately you began to think to yourself, man, this is awesome. This is exactly where I need to be. You see, if you want to find the negative, you'll find it. And I will tell you that you will be miserable. And I will tell you that so will the people around you. And you will drive them away. It will cost you significantly. Slate, why do people complain so much? Well, I really think that it starts when we're children. Because as children, I think those of you who are parents, you'll agree with me, as children, we start out in life thinking that we are the center and that the world revolves around us. And many times, even as parents, I think if we're honest about this, we kind of feed that, right? Oh, you're unhappy. Oh, you don't like this. And so we start doing everything that we can to please our wonderful children because all we want is them to be happy. And so we kind of make our children the center. And then many times what happens is we grow up. And as adults, we still think we're the center. And that the world still revolves around us and what we want. And when we don't get what we want and when things don't go the way we feel like, they should go, then we feel like it is our God-given right to complain. And the fact of the matter is this, God is really the center of the story. It's not you and it's not me. We talked about this before. God doesn't exist to serve us. We exist to serve Him. He's the King of Kings and He is the Lord of Lords. And when we get that backwards, then that's when we begin to complain. Let me wrap up by just sharing with you a couple of verses that hopefully will help us restrain some of the complaining. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29 is one of those verses. Paul says, do not let any, what, church? Unwholesome talk come out of your what? Out of your mouths. In other words, if you are tempted to complain about something, if you are tempted to say something negative, Paul would say to you, shut your mouth. If you got to, grit your teeth, but shut your mouth. Don't say it. And it's amazing how less we end up talking, right? And he goes on to say, if you are going to speak, let it be what is helpful. And notice the word he uses, only. Only what is helpful for what, church? Building others up according to their needs, that they may benefit from those who listen. In other words, it's like our moms used to tell us, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it at all. And if you are going to say something, let it be something that's going to encourage people, that's going to really build them up. For example, instead of Slate saying, you know what, this traffic is absolutely driving me crazy. This is ridiculous. This person can't drive. I need to be saying, God, thank you that I have a car. Thank you, God, that I'm even able to drive. Thank you that I'm not out here having to walk for miles and miles and miles in the heat, in the humidity, on rainy days, in the cold. God, thank you so much for blessing me. Or maybe instead of saying, man, I hate my job and I can't stand my boss and I can't stand my coworkers, maybe we say, God, thank you so much for the job that I have. Because a lot of people don't have jobs. A lot of people aren't able to work. And so, God, thank you for allowing me to do that. And God, thank you for this opportunity to be a light in such a dark world, to have an opportunity to make a difference in people's lives. In other words, it's turning that complaining into praise. Because here's what I've come to realize. Complaining never makes anything better. I can't tell you how many family days I have destroyed because I chose, instead of rejoicing and to be happy and to praise God for how good He is to us, I chose to have a negative, complaining attitude. And I'm telling you, it didn't solve anything. In fact, it put my family in a bad spirit. And it can absolutely ruin the day. In fact, there have been times when my wife has had to look at me and just say, "Stop it. You are ruining the day. Be happy that we're together and be happy with all the things we're able to do." And then I leave feeling guilty. And what I've learned is complaining, it never makes anything better. It just makes it worse. But then also, Philippians chapter 2, 14 through 15, and I'm done after this. He says, "Do everything without complaining or arguing so that you may become blameless," and what, church? "Pure, children of God without fault in a crooked and depraved generation." Now let me ask you a question. Who is blameless and pure and without fault? You hear what Jesus is saying? Don't complain, be like Jesus. You know, there's a lot of things that Paul could have injected there. Don't curse, don't lie, don't steal, don't look at another person lustfully because I want you to be pure. But instead, he says, don't complain. Don't argue. Be like Jesus. You get into verse 17. And again, Paul is getting ready to die. I mean, he feels like he's at the end of his life, and this is what he says in prison. "But even if I'm being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I'm glad. And I rejoice with all of you so that you too should be glad." And what, church? "And rejoice with me." How could Paul say that? Because of what he says in Galatians 2:20. He says, "I've been crucified with Christ. I no longer live, but it is Christ who lives in me." You know why Paul could say that? Because Paul no longer looked at himself as being in the center. He says it's all about Christ, and Christ lives in me. And so here's what I would say to you in closing today. Choose to rejoice. Choose to be like Jesus. Choose today, start today deciding, you know what? Complaining's not getting me anywhere, and God is so good. I've just been missing out on all those blessings. Our words matter. And so we want to think before we speak. We don't want to complain. And so the invitation's yours. It may be that today, maybe you need prayers. Maybe there are some things that maybe you haven't thought about in concerns to just how much God has blessed you. And just how much God has been so good to you. Or it may be that there's something else going on in your life as a Christian. We'd love to pray with you. One of our elders will come forward this morning and take your confession. Or we have a room in the back where we'll pray for you. Or you can talk with one of our leaders. Or it may be today that you want to give your life to Jesus because Jesus loves you. He died for you. And man, we are so blessed through Jesus. And so today, if you need to respond for any reason, won't you come? Together we stand and sing.